Good evening. It's Saturday night, and you know what time it is? It's time for the Bible study. We're back to the Old Testament today with my excellent guests, who are as follows: Dinah K and John Fisher. How are you doing this evening?
Pretty good.
Very good, thanks.
Great. You excited for 2 Kings 17?
Yes, I am.
Some bad stuff is going to happen to the nation of Israel, sorry to say. But perhaps stuff from which we can learn and benefit nonetheless. Let me pray, and then we can get going. Lord God, you are the beginning and the end. You were there throughout all the events that we're going to learn about this evening, and indeed, you ordained them to happen. And the same is true today. You are at work, you're powerful, you're a God who knows what's going to happen, what's best for us. We ask for your help in as we study a bit of history from your perspective. In Jesus' name, amen. Right, let's go. There we go. Oh, I'm being ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the top. So maybe before we start, actually, we could do a little bit of context setting. Or maybe the first verse is a good springboard for talking about what's the context for anybody who's because we're swinging in right in the middle of what we call 2 Kings, but what John Fisher, you just told me, is not called 2 Kings in the Jew reigns, right?
Right. In the older Catholic Bibles, it would be called 4 Kings. 1st and 2nd Samuel are 1st and 2nd Kings in the older numbering, and 1st and 2nd Kings in the Protestant canon would translate to 3rd Kings and 4th Kings in the older Catholic canons, because they follow in, I think, the Septuagint numbering. For Hebrew Bibles, they actually combine 1st and 2nd Samuel into just the Book of Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings into just the Book of Kings. I've always found the numbering of it odd, though, for 1st and 2nd Samuel. Like with the Jewish Bible, I understand, but in 2nd Samuel, Samuel dies. He's not around there anymore, but it's still considered to be one of his books. So, yeah.
I think we should rename Acts to 2nd Luke. What do you reckon?
Actually, I would like that.
Yeah. All right, so here we are in the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah. Hoshea, the son of Elah, began to reign in Samaria over Israel, and he reigned 9 years, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, yet not as the kings of Israel who were before him. Okay, let's pause there and make sure that we're all caught up on what the situation is. So we're looking at, this is at this point 2 nations: Judah, which is in the south, and then Israel, which is most of the tribes in the north. And of the kings talked about throughout the books of 1 and 2 Kings, or did you say 3 and 4 Kings?
Yes.
There are only really 9 good kings. There's lots of kings. Only 9 of them are any decent at all, morally. And all of them were ruling over Judah. So Israel has all terrible, evil kings. And this guy is no different. He's described, Ahaz here. So Ahaz is in the south, in Judah, and is really terrible. In the north, the son of Elah, a guy called Hoshea, begins to reign. He does what's evil in the sight of the Lord, but in comparison with previous kings of Israel, he's not as bad. There is a lot of stuff later that we can get into exactly what is meant by doing evil in the sight of the Lord. But I thought that was some important context. Was there anything else you wanted to mention?
Go ahead, Dana.
Thanks. I think it's quite interesting to consider that this one obviously wasn't a good king, but he still wasn't as bad as the other ones. So in comparison, when you think how bad the previous kings were, I think it's a very important part in this verse, because it shows that they were all absolutely terrible, and until then he was just slightly better. It just shows how bad they were in general.
Exactly.
But
John, you were going to say something.
Oh, yes, I was actually going to add a bit more context, although it's not super relevant to what the events are going to unfold here. For those of you who might not know who Ahaz is, just off the top of your heads, if you go to Isaiah chapter 7, that very famous chapter which deals with the prophecy of the virgin birth, Ahaz is actually the king which Isaiah is addressing. And Ahaz is also the king who, when Isaiah says, ask for a sign, high as heaven, deep as Sheol, Ahaz says, oh, I'm not going to tempt the Lord. And Isaiah is understandably miffed at that. And he says, well, I'm just going to give you a sign anyway. And of course, that's where the famous prophecy lies. But in any case,
the virgin
Ahaz
shall be with child and will bear a son. And his,
so Ahaz is definitely not a great guy himself. In another passage in scripture, he's even pointed out as offering a child of his for sacrifice. So not a terrific fellow, but his son, on the other hand, is a very good king. His son, Hezekiah. So at the very least, there's one good thing about his reign. So just for a bit of context, that's a little more about his life. And that would be something else you'd probably be more familiar with, viewer.
It's funny to think of Isaiah being around at the time this was written, because we obviously have such an extensive record of the things that Isaiah was saying. So it's nice to connect those dots. Yes, so indeed, the others.
In fact, what's funny is the war that's ensuing between Damascus, Judah, and Israel up in the north. The two kings that are giving Ahaz problems. That actually comes into play in this chapter, as well as the following chapter as well.
Right. Should we get into it? You may have noticed as I was scrolling back up to the top that this is quite a long chapter. So we better not hang around, especially since we started late. Against him came up Shalmaneser. This is where I should have practiced saying the words before we started. Against him came up Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, and Hoshea became his vassal and paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria found treachery in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to So, the king of Egypt, and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. Then the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria, and for 3 years he besieged it. I think it's quite unpleasant to be in a city that's being besieged, I would think. 3 years seems like a long time to be under siege to me. I assume if you're besieging a city, then it's quite tough to get resources in and out. Is that one of the main issues? Rather than, I always used to imagine it being like constant like rocks being hurled down, like the scene at the end of Lord of the Rings. But actually, what you're basically doing is starving the place out, right?
I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with this show, but growing up, did any of you watch the show Redwall? It was based off of a good book series.
No, I didn't know that.
So it's a really good cartoon. It's actually based on a medieval period, although it has animals in places of people. They're anthropomorphized, but the main point is Redwall was this abbey/fortress, and there'd be always besiegings by the main villain. And at the end of the cartoon series, you see them like climbing up walls, getting up various ways, shooting arrows, etc. That's how I, growing up with that, imagine a besieging of certain walls. Yeah.
But you'd be doing well to defend a city for 3 years of constantly people climbing up your walls and like battering it down. I don't think that's really exactly what it means. But it's interesting that it's shocking in a way, isn't it? The king of Assyria comes in, invades all the land, and comes to Samaria. So yes, this is we're seeing the end. It's basically what's about to happen here for Israel.
Yeah. It's also quite interesting because so obviously if he was to pay the tribute, so I've read some commentary. We'll see how my memory works here. So basically, they were trying to. There was this movement. They were trying to stop paying tribute to Assyria, basically, and they were trying to conspire with Egypt at the time. But obviously, the king of Syria found out about it, and he got very, very angry. So he decided that he's just going to basically imprison him and take what's his, basically. So they could have avoided it. I mean, they can't avoid God's judgment, but they could have potentially avoided that specific situation if they didn't decide to conspire with Egypt. But they kind of ruined themselves, basically.
On top of that, the Sumerians, if any of you are interested in whatever happened to them, they actually do live on up until the time of Christ, and they would be called the Samaritans. In fact, even up until the time of Christ, they would say that, oh, we've always had allegiance to the true worship of God. But if anyone reads 2 Kings, you'll see that it was only really preserved in Judah.
Yeah, exactly. So let's carry on. So yes, we've seen. They side with Egypt, end up getting besieged. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he carried the Israelites away to Assyria and placed them in Halah and on the Heber on the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. And this occurred because. And this is interesting. This occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord our God. This isn't the sort of comment that you would find in contemporary historical accounts, I might suggest. They might say, this occurred because Israel's military forces had diminished to the point that the Assyrians thought they could take them. Or this occurred because, geopolitical this or that. But we see the Bible's framing here of history is actually that the behavior of Israel towards God led God to punish them, and indeed he had been pretty patient, because if you read through 1 and 2 Kings up to this point, there's many kings that go by, and God gives them, as it were, chance after chance to turn things around, and it's clearly not happening. So even though this king, we see at the beginning of the chapter, was not as bad as the previous kings, God is slow to anger, but eventually his judgment does come. Maybe we can apply that to our lives, that we can get away with sinning and ignoring God for a long time, but we shouldn't be lulled into the false sense of security and think that God's judgment never comes. Ultimately, everybody faces judgment and has to be ready for that.
Exactly. Although I do want to say something in defense of historians, while they don't really have an ability to say, well, because of sin or something, they don't have the edge of biblical inspiration and God's ability to inspire through the Holy Spirit. So
that's an important point. Yeah. Yes, you can't just look at somebody who's been defeated historically and then assume, oh well, that's just clearly God's judgment on those people. I would suggest that yes, this is inspired history rather than just better history.
It's speaking of history, actually. I've got some trivia here from the commentary.
Excellent.
Yes. So if you go back a little bit, there's the bit that says that here, Right. So he carried the Israelites away to Assyria. So apparently Assyrians were absolutely horrible with their treatment of people. They would be moving from country to country, because apparently they would take higher classes of people, they would move them to their country, and they would leave the peasants back in the conquered country, if that makes sense. But then the people who are being moved over, they were literally, it's very interesting, and ties in with what you guys were saying about God's judgment as well. So they would attach them together naked with strings and pierce them like fish hooks. And it's very interesting, because then you think when the God's judgment actually comes, it may come in a very humiliating manner. And it's very important to remember that there's nothing to, you just can't escape it. And it may be absolutely terrible and traumatizing for you. So yeah, I found it quite interesting when I read about this.
Wait. So just to clarify, they would use fish hooks?
Apparently, they would pierce their lips together, and that's how they would lead them together, if that makes sense.
So, in other words, God made the Assyrians fishers of men.
Oh,
Basically.
Sorry, I just had to.
That's an example of making a link between two passages that really shouldn't be made.
I like to think God is a comedian at times.
I give you that, but yeah, I'm not sure that is accurate hermeneutics, but maybe we can argue about that. Yeah, so that's true. Carrying away the Israelites here probably did mean anybody who was of any use. So I think I can't remember now. Is Daniel was he from Judah or was he from Israel? Can't remember. Anyway, he was carried. He went to Babylon, didn't he? So it must be he was from Judah. So yeah, similar thing there. He was one of the young, healthy, intelligent people. So he got snapped up in the first wave of exile. Eventually, all the people who were left in the land would have just been the, elderly, diseased Israelites, and then they would have resettled it with Assyrians, I guess, having taken all the other Israelites away as slaves. But yes, Assyria has a bad reputation for, I think most people groups at this time were not particularly kind when they had defeated you. But yes,
lack of a Geneva Convention can do that to you.
You're giving the Geneva Convention a lot of power there in that. But yeah, all right. So yes, the people had sinned against the Lord their God, who brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods and walked in the customs of the nations which the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. So the point, I think, of always saying that it was the God who brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the reason that that's always repeated as a refrain, or maybe one of the reasons, is that God had proven himself as a powerful, good God who was on their side in the most dramatic and obvious way, and yet they had continued on a different path afterwards. Maybe another example of where people who say, "Oh, of course I'd follow God if only he would do this or that miracle," are misunderstanding human nature and the sin in the heart of man. Despite these being the very people who God had previously rescued out of Egypt, they had completely disregarded God as soon as they'd been made comfortable, and they just wanted to follow the sham, stupid religion of the nations nearby. I think that's in reference to your
Fishers
comment.
Man, yes. I'll be here all week.
Yeah, should we carry on?
Let's
do that. Okay. And in the customs that the kings of Israel had practiced, and the people of Israel did secretly against the Lord their God things that were not right. They built for themselves high places in all the towns, from watchtower to fortified city. Could anyone explain what the high places were?
probably altars for sacrifice.
And what's wrong with that?
Not to the right god.
That is a bit of an issue. Yeah.
Yeah. And they would literally build altars and they would perform very specific rituals that were for those wrong gods as well. What's also funny to me, I'm just going to mention, is that they were trying to do it secretly. When after all this time, they should have already learned that God obviously has got, the insight to know what they're doing. And yet they continued to try, pretending like they could do both in a way, which was just not really smart.
Yeah, it's not a very good secret if, 4,000 years later, people are reading about it. That's a sign that the secret got out.
Pretty much.
And of course, the worship that God had demanded from these people included visiting the temple, which was in Judah. So they tried to find ways around it, because the king of Israel was always assuming that when people were coming, "Hail, Templar, how's it going?" Oh, well, he's visible but not talking. He's connecting his mic. So the king of Israel was thinking, oh, well, if people are going down to worship in the temple in Judah, they're not going to come back, potentially. So hopefully we can avoid... Hey, Templar, how are you doing?
I fell asleep.
Well,
No.
I mean, sleep is important. So, I think that's a perfectly valid turn of events. But thanks for jumping in. So they built themselves high places in all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city. They set up for themselves pillars and asherim on every high hill and under every green tree. So if you were to wander through this nation, which was supposedly God's people, you'd just be almost tripping over the signs of the disloyalty of the people. You would almost think it wasn't a Christian or a Jewish nation, because it was just full of other nations' religious sites.
Yeah. This is just kind of a mark of the decadency of Israel. Usually it's only when they're in their worst times that they realize, okay, maybe I just do need to repent, considering the national status of where we are. It's never like when Israel comes to a high point where they stay devout. They always have to be taken down a peg before they realize, oh, wow, we've really been rebellious here.
Yeah. And a lot of this chapter, I should say, in prep for the fact that we're going to read through a bunch of this, is kind of justification for what God's doing to these people. It's like, it's kind of like a justification. It's, why is it that God allowed the Assyrians to come in and destroy the country completely? Well, here's a big, long list of very valid reasons. Much like how on Judgment Day, each one of us will be held to account for our actions. And at that point, nobody's going to be able to say, I don't deserve the judgment. It'll be like, oh, no, fair cop.
I might be... Yeah, so... Asherah poles are a little curious thing too. It is known that that's where babies were sacrificed, right?
At high places, is it?
Well, Asherah poles are like...
right, Asherah poles.
Yeah. They're given to the supposed claimed wife of God. So it's interesting in a theological sense. This is like who's God's wife, right? And today we know. We might say it's the church, perhaps. So in many ways, this is ironic, I think, because it's like they're sacrificing innocence to a future pure wife. I don't know, but a weird connection there. But it is interesting that one of the sins of Israel at this time was basically building Planned Parenthood facilities and casting their children into the fire, basically to rid themselves of the joy of children.
Yeah, we're gonna come to a verse a bit later about the sacrificing of children. So I was gonna kind of hold off on that.
I will
But
shut.
oh well, no problem, because I was just saying that was a good teaser. Yeah. So they made offerings on all the high places, as the nations did, whom the Lord carried away before them, and they did wicked things, provoking the Lord to anger. And they served idols, for which the Lord had said to them, "You shall not do this." Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, saying, "Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes in accordance with all the law that I commanded your fathers and that I sent to you by my servants, the prophets." By the way, I think reading Kings is a really good, it sort of goes hand in hand with reading the prophets, because the prophets are going on and on about turn from your ways, judgment will come. And then you see them refusing to change historically, and then judgment coming. And it's like, oh, you kind of, when you read Kings, when you think about the prophets, you're like, yeah, go prophets. You know, they're saying what you want to say to the people. It's like, no, stop behaving that way. Turn back. Can't you see what's going to happen? Like, how stupid can you be, thinking that you're going to one up the king of the universe? But then that's also our attitude as well. Quite often when we sin, and you know, if we saw the version of our lives written up in the same way that Kings is written, we'd look pretty foolish as well, I think.
Yeah, that is true. But it's also very interesting, considering that, like, God would never just destroy his servants. He wouldn't do that without a warning. So every single time, this is a very interesting lesson as well, because God constantly brings plenty of warnings, that, as you just said with the prophets, you constantly get reminders, warnings, please don't do it, please don't do it. You literally know what you're not supposed to do. And then I think this is also a very good lesson for us these days as well, because the warnings are there, that we still have the Bible as well to, you know, learn from. But, like, you know, are you going to heed the warning or not?
But they would not listen, and were stubborn, as their fathers had been, who did not believe in the Lord their God. They despised his statutes and his covenant that he made with their fathers, and the warnings that he gave them. They went after false idols and became false, and they followed the nations that were around them, concerning whom the Lord had commanded them that they should not do like them. This is kind of the nation equivalent of peer pressure, isn't it? It's like they wanted to be cool. They wanted to do the fun stuff that they saw over the border. They didn't want to follow their annoying religious parents. And so they just kind of rebelled and did whatever they wanted. And they should have, I guess they should have listened, because they're about to get their comeuppance. I feel like in two minds about this kind of chapter, because on the one hand, I'm like, oh, it's terrible. I don't like seeing the destruction. But then there is this other part of you, which is like, you've got to love justice. Like when you see that people are deliberately disobeying God, there is a bit of you that's like, come on, God, just, you know, get in there and show them what's what.
I work with that a lot also in contemporary times. Like no one wants to see the shaming of their homeland, but at the same time, every time America gets shamed, I can't help I can't help but think, you know, we kind of deserve it. Right? We've spoiled the gift of supremacy into degeneracy. So it's something we have to, like, every time China does something about us and shames us in front of the UN, or every time we can't even like topple Syria because Russia's got them first. Every time one of these foreign policies fail and another president gets embarrassed by ridiculous policies that are never going to work if they thought about it, I can't help but think, well, I mean, it's kind of justified for God to consort with our enemies to bring us into a state of shaming. I don't think we're gonna collapse or anything like that. We're far too early in God's grace for that to happen, but we are deep enough into God's grace that we're gonna start seeing a lot more shamings of our power, as an American at least.
Yeah, it's an interesting question how nationalist we ought to be, given that our citizenship is in heaven, right?
Yeah.
One other thing to keep in mind here is the act of worship itself. It wasn't done in a sense of saying one God was right and one other God was wrong. Like the Jews would probably be happy to recognize Yahweh was a true God, but they would have said he was just one God of many. And the idea of worshiping multiple gods was in a way to hedge your bets, because the more gods you prayed for, the thinking is, hey, we're really just playing both sides here. Someone's going to come out on top, and it's best just to play all sides. And that's kind of a distrusting and unfaithful attitude, because you're not confident enough that the one God who did bring you out of the land of Egypt, as was previously said, is going to help you withstand these mighty empires. So this is really just a fact of directly not having enough faith in the various signs that your nation has been given to you. And what is here is just seeing Israel succumb to the consequences which would befall any small nation in the realm of these mighty conquerors.
Perhaps this is a good place to take people if they are wanting to go down if say they come from a Hindu background or a sort of Buddhist background, and they want to bring Christianity under their polygamous, is that the term? Banner.
Polytheistic?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Polygamous is like multiple wives, isn't it? Polytheistic banner is like, oh yeah, there's many ways to God, right? Well, that didn't work out so well in the Bible for people who thought the same thing. It's not a new Eastern idea that we can bring together different routes to God. It's just a wrong idea.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, even today you kind of see India slowly shifting to a concept that many Hindus now view all of these gods as different faces of the same like Brahman god, and they even kind of borrow heavily on Christianity in a sense that the Brahman, what's the high god in Hindu? Does anyone remember?
Well, in Hinduism, it would be the Brahmin. This would be like the idea of the all, and you have kind of all these various and you have, of course, within the Brahmin, Brahma, you have Shiva, you have Vishnu. These would be like the three main powerful deities, and then you have all these minor deities who are various incarnations of those three main deities. How one breaks this down, some like to see it in terms of polytheism. Some actually see it as a kind of monotheism of one god taking various modes. I've never really seen it in a Trinitarian context. Maybe some have tried to adopt Trinitarian speak, but
they are increasingly nowadays people are viewing those three heads of their mystery god as like a trinity, and they're kind of like trying to cope it into Christianity.
Interesting.
Which even like the art of it, they're starting to, it's not particularly new. There are ancient traditions of them drawing the Brahman, the central god as three-headed, but anyway, it's interesting how like to basically adapt it to modern times, they've started kind of transforming it a little bit, and I always find it funny because like the atheist cope is Christianity is borrowing heavily on Hinduism, but if you look at the actual historical development, it's the Hindus that are grabbing ideas from Christianity to slowly shift it into a more Trinitarian view.
Now we're having a complaint about the name of the stream. Well, Chris, what should I name the stream? I'll admit I didn't give very much thought.
So I can't tell you what to rename the stream into. All I can say is don't rename it by putting 3 brackets on each end of Israel. Just don't.
Maybe that's what Chris is after.
What's the name? I didn't see the
name.
The
end of Israel.
I should have.
No, keep it. That's based.
It's a chapter that's about the end of Israel, isn't it?
Yeah, the end of the kingdom of Israel, not the modern state.
I don't know if Chris is complaining generally about my sort of clickbait capitalization, or the fact that YouTube might be flagging that I'm talking about potentially problematic topics. And so it's hard to talk about the Old Testament without talking about, the Jews, right?
Yeah.
They're in it for quite a bit of it.
Anyway, right. I'll take into your consideration in naming the stream in future. I'd be interested to know opinions on how I'm naming the streams in general. I've gone for the super clickbait route, but
I just want to bring up the thing about what John Fisher was saying with like hedging your bets. It's also polytheism is also a way to basically like give up responsibility for trying to figure it out. You're giving up the responsibility of honoring God to God honoring you to prove He's the true one.
Yeah,
and it's a bit of humans have this tendency to like kind of take their sin and project it onto God, and oftentimes this is how you get like polytheism to start with, because a lot of times the pagan gods, if they're not based off of elements of the environment, they're based off of elements of the psychology, and so it's interesting how we project our faults and what we're suffering under into gods to like cope with, basically, rather than looking for the true God.
Yeah. And let's carry on, shall we? So they went after false idols and became false, and they followed the nations that were around them concerning, we've read this bit, and they abandoned all the commandments of the Lord their God and made for themselves metal images of 2 calves. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? You might remember back to Moses coming down on Sinai, and they made calves. It seems to be a recurring thing. But is calves from Egypt? Is that where the
in the desert when they were making the Exodus? Moses goes up to Sinai. He sees them making a golden calf, just one. This time they're doubling it, so they're even going further than the disobedience of their ancestors. And the Asherah would be, of course, as Lou Templar said, that the Asherah pole would essentially be another idol where sacrifices were also made.
I also want to point out here that instead of 1 calf in the Exodus, now it's 2. This is because in the later development of Judaism, there was a view of a lesser and greater Yahweh. And this is kind of like hinted at here, but it comes off a lot more. It also develops a lot more in writing and actual like theological writing after the exile. But right before the exile, we see this like shift to the nature of God being dualistic, and then they add in this like third element of Asherah, as like the spirit is a feminine in many places. So if it's not outright the wife of God, it'll be like the spirit of God. This is basically an attempt to like conceptualize their understanding of the Trinity into like material things. And then, of course, you have Baal over there who comes in as I mentioned before. Baal is like, it's weird. Baal's an interesting word because it also translates as Lord. And sometimes you'll see in the Old Testament they worship the Baals rather than Baal, and that's because like they worship the lords. It can somewhat be understood as a corruption of Elohim being like plural.
So in the Hebrew, the word Baal is used. Is used only for this context, or sometimes for God as well?
It's used for both the word Lord and the name of Baal. It's the same word. Baal.
Yeah.
Baal is.
But that seems confusing then. If you're reading this verse and it says, and and they worshipped all the host of heaven and served Lord. Yeah. The Lord doesn't seem like a problem.
But like I think the writer wants to emphasize the reality, and there will be grammatical indicators to know if you're talking about the God or just like Lord as a generic leader or the Lord Baal. Or it is difficult. It is difficult to understand this stuff as a translation, and maybe in the Hebrew there are more indicators of what one they're talking about. But it is true that you can translate as either or. Yeah.
It's interesting, Larry saying that Israel will be restored. Definitely, I would say bits at the end of Romans seem to indicate that. Mr. Patriarch. Yeah. Did anybody catch Jordan Peterson visited us last week briefly? I was hoping to catch him and ask him a few, really leading questions and then missummarize his answers, but he didn't stay long enough.
Are you saying that? What's the name of that BBC
Kathy
broadcaster?
Newman.
Kathy Newman.
Yeah, Channel 4 broadcaster. Well, I don't know why I'm defending the BBC.
Former broadcaster, now designated to the dustbin of failed interviewers.
Oh, really? Does she not work for Channel 4 anymore?
No, she's been fired a few times now, actually.
Oof.
Oh, I didn't know that. All right, and here we go. And they burned their sons and their daughters as an offering, and used divination and omens, and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Yeah, here we go. So this is the verse I was saying about. So now we can talk about child sacrifice. And I mean, if anybody has any thoughts on like modern parallels, for example.
Yes.
So something I'm kind of curious about when it says "and sold themselves to do evil," I'm kind of getting a prostitution vibe, but it might not be that. I'm just trying to get across what they might be saying here. Might also, I mean, it might also be slavery, but not sure they would do that to do evil.
It's probably temple prostitution.
Okay.
I would bet money on that.
I'd be interested to see other translations. So this is 2 Kings 17, verse 17. It looks like a lot of translations have the same, sold themselves to do evil. So presumably that's a fairly accurate translation. But yes, what it actually means.
It may also include, if it's not temple prostitution, it would likely be mercenary work. This area is pretty. Why is no one wearing my shirt? Oh, well, we all have laundry day, Sedler.
So according to my Knox Bible, it says they must worship all the hosts of heaven and become Baal's servants, consecrate their sons and daughters by passage through the fire, take their orders from wizards and soothsayers, enslave themselves to defiance of the Lord's will, and provoke his vengeance. So it was that the Lord in anger banished Israel from his presence, and the tribe of Judah stood alone. Okay, that's a little later, but apparently here Knox is and I'm using the Knox Bible, by the way. Monsignor Ronald Knox translates that as a form of enslavement to the passions. So enslavement to going against God. Now, to be fair, Knox is more of a dynamic translator, so he's not translating it word for word, but sense for sense. And that's kind of the sense he's giving it.
Yeah, so it's a very powerful metaphor, of course, that's extended into the New Testament, where if you sell yourself, you then are required to do whatever your master bids you. And the idea is that some people are servants of evil and slaves to sin, and everything they do is in that direction, and then other people are then slaves to righteousness. Not that, well, sometimes it seems like the opposite of slave to sin is freedom, but actually I more often see that it's being a slave but to a good master, which is interesting and slightly unexpected.
Yeah, Thomas Aquinas usually understands freedom. Like, we understand freedom in the modern sense as the ability to do whatever you want. Thomas says, no, it's actually the ability to do the good. A good idea or notion of it would be, if I had the freedom to go on drugs and I did drugs, I'm not actually freer than anyone. In fact, because I'm addicted to drugs, I can do less things, and I'm less able to be virtuous than more virtuous. So on this viewpoint, when you're in heaven and you're unable to sin, you're not less free, you're actually more free, because you're not bound to sin or to defy God, and you can actually exercise the most ability, not less.
Right, let's head back a verse. So burning the sons and daughters as offering. Now, I don't know if this is accurate, but I heard that the phrase "fire in your belly" comes from this. So, if you say, "Oh, this puts fire in your belly," what they did was they put they made a statue. I can't remember. Was it of Baal? Maybe. Anyway, one of the neighboring deities, as it were, which kind of had its hands out. And then and the place in Israel where this is done ended up being called something like the beating of the drums, and they'd have the baby in the arms of this statue, which had fire burning inside it, and then the baby would literally like be burned to death, and they'd beat drums so that you couldn't hear the baby screaming. Pretty rough stuff. I only mention that because I think it's important to have something quite vivid to understand the depths of depravity and sin that was going on. And this is including kings are recorded as having done this with their own children. I think most, even modern people who find divinations and omens don't give them that visceral sense of the horror of sin. They at least understand child sacrifice as being, an offense to everything that's good. People at the time probably, when this was happening, contemporary, people would have had the same reaction to child sacrifice as most modern people do to what we maybe think of as the equivalent, which is abortion. It's like, people have different opinions about child sacrifice, don't they? I personally think child sacrifice is wrong, but I wouldn't argue about it in polite society.
All I know is my body, my right to worship.
Yeah, that child is mine, and therefore I have absolutely the right to burn it in the arms of a bronze statue.
And if you don't like it, you're just a bigot.
Yeah, what can I say? This text is extremely extremely offensive to me for being against the progressive idea of child sacrifice. This is interesting as a side point. I understand the pre-17th century definition of liberty was more akin to independence or self-sustenance. This way, being a slave to sin makes a person anything but free.
Yeah, it's been said. There's a way. I was listening to one of my favorite favorite pastors earlier, and he put it like this. It was a similar topic, but if you're not studying freedom in Christ, you're studying how to be a slave, which is an interesting thought to think you do, because you're gonna be studying something no matter what you're doing. Your brain wants information, so if you're not studying how to free yourself from the things around you in the world, you're from the way God defines it, you're basically, by definition, spending your time studying how to serve the things around you that aren't God. And you don't want to do it. It's not just about, like, understand the concept of worship is like, what do you fear? What do you spend your time thinking about? And I think a lot of men our age, if we're all in like the early 30s, late 20s range, it's probably going to be like, most of them aren't actually worshiping God. They're worshiping like lust and a desire for a wife. It's like kind of pathetic. So it's something you have to crack your brain into analyzing what is your brain focused on. This is why I always encourage people to like write down what you're thinking at, like at the start of every hour, write down what you're thinking about and compile it over the course of days and see where your brain is at most of the time. Like there's a little bit of calculus there, because like it depends on how fast you're actually thinking, because you might cycle through several thoughts. So you kind of need to like increase the amount of points of contact with your thoughts to see what you're really thinking about, maybe whatever. But you'll discover what you actually worship by doing this, if you're honest with yourself, of course. And what should be the most on your thoughts is you should be thinking the most of what does God think of whatever it is you're facing. Or it should be like, oh, thank you, God, and enjoy. Make God the majority timeshare holder of your thoughts, and you'll find that there's a different outlook that gets produced from that. That's a lot more healthier and motivating. Yeah.
Luke Templar, one of our commentators is asking, what pastor? Name, please.
Name piece. Oh, Jonathan Fisk is a Lutheran pastor I like to listen to. He did a show today that was pretty good. Conservative, more conservative than progressive. The state of American Lutheranism is one thing in these days and age.
Yeah. Lutherans, if you are out there and listening, I would always suggest everyone convert to the Catholic Church. But if you insist on remaining Lutheran, then I would advise you to at least go to the Missouri Synod, and not to something like the Evangelical Lutheran Society.
Society is a great word because it's not a religion anymore. It's just
Here's something exciting. For the first time ever, we've had a comment come into chat from Twitch. So the proof that we are indeed streaming to multiple platforms. So I'm pleased to see we have one viewer, but you'll have to compete against the 13 viewers we currently have on YouTube. Just so everyone knows the colossal size of this YouTube channel. Yes. Hello, Anodus 101 on Twitch. Right. Oh yes, I was just going to say it is interesting that the worship, when people stop worshiping God, they immediately start worshiping something else. I think that's because in human nature we're built to worship, right? God's made us as worshiping creatures, and that's why the objection that I wouldn't want to go to heaven because I wouldn't want to worship all day doesn't actually make sense. Because as human beings, we just automatically, when we spend a lot of time thinking about something and we think it's important, we end up. Oh, you can't find me on Twitch, says Sijin the Loyal. Okay, I'll check if the link that's in the description is accurate. So I just thought it was interesting that the human heart is so worship focused, and if you direct the worship in the right place, it's extremely fulfilling thing to spend your time doing. To worshiping God is not a diminishing, subservient activity, but is actually the fulfillment of your purpose that you were created for.
Could I read a quote? It's one that I really enjoy by Cardinal John Henry Newman. He writes, "To me, nothing is so consoling, so piercing, so thrilling, so overcoming as the Mass. Said as it is among us, I could attend Masses forever and not be tired. It is not a mere form of words. It is a great action, the greatest action that can be on earth. It is not the invocation merely, but if I dare use the word, the evocation of the eternal. Here becomes present on the altar in flesh and blood before whom angels bow and devils tremble. This is that awful event which is the scope and the interpretation of every part of solemnity." Now I know you're probably not going to agree with all his theology, especially God being literally present on the altar, viewers, but just remember this. That's the attitude of a saint on attending Masses forever, always having a thrill of going. This is kind of what we all should be aiming for. And now I say this as a Catholic. I'm not at the point in this life where I could say, I could always just go to Masses forever and never get tired. I really want to get to that point. That's kind of the end goal. But to me, it's having that attitude, like thinking about worshiping God in that way that I've always wanted to pursue. And to have that attitude, that's like the pinnacle of being a saint. But you can only really get there when you become less addicted to sin, to procrastination, to your own downtime. And that takes a lot of work and effort. This is why atheists can be very lazy in having this idea. Who wants to work and actually put in all that effort just to worship, when really, if you're a loving Christian, you want to put all that time and effort for someone you love, especially God, to be able to appreciate it. That's why heaven is that great, because you're in a point where sin isn't holding you back and you could do what you truly will love to do.
Absolutely. I'm sorry. I'm just sorting something out. Could somebody fill for a second? Because otherwise I can't control the. All right, don't worry. I'm back. Right. Should we carry on?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry I slightly lost my place. But I think whatever you were saying, John, was absolutely correct, and I fully stand behind it. All right. Yes, let's carry on. Therefore, the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah only. And Judah also did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the customs that Israel had introduced. So, although Judah wasn't as bad, basically the bad habits did filter south eventually. And the Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel and afflicted them and gave them into the hand of plunderers until he had cast them out of his sight. When he had torn Israel from the house of David, they made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king. And Jeroboam drove Israel from following the Lord and then made them commit great sin. The people of Israel walked in all the sins that Jeroboam did. They did not depart from them until the Lord removed Israel out of his sight, as he had spoken by all his servants, the prophets. Does anyone have any comments on this little section?
So I'm thinking, wow, Israel was already pretty bad, and now it's saying, oh, things got even worse with Jeroboam. I'm like, what could he have done to make this worse?
Yeah, pretty much. You get that feeling quite a lot reading through 1 and 2 Kings.
Yeah, exactly. Wow, this can't get any worse, and it just got worse.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's pretty clear the narrative there, isn't it? It's basically, yeah, it's kind of a summary of what ended up happening. God made a people group for himself, gave them the commands, treated them well. The people disobeyed, walked away from him. Eventually, he accepted their decision, and then the judgment that followed was completely deserved. And that's much the same story of many individual people. And in fact, all of us, this would be our story. We would look back on our own lives and think, yeah, here we are getting judgment deservedly. The only way that doesn't happen for anybody is through the grace of God. And is undeserved, but God graciously gives us the opportunity to escape from the judgment that we do deserve. Yeah, and they carry on doing it even as they're being destroyed. It's up to the point of destruction. They're continuing to disobey. So it's like in a movie when they want the villain to get killed by the good guy at the end of the film, they always make the villain do something awful, like try to kill the good guy before he gets dispatched, as a bit of a nod to the audience that it's okay for the hero to kill this guy because he really is unrepentant right to the end. It's the same way here. We see the people of Israel continuing in sin just right up to the very last second. So Israel was exiled from their own land to Assyria until this day, and the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the people of Israel. And they took possession of Samaria and lived in its cities. And at the beginning of their dwelling there, they did not fear the Lord. Therefore, the Lord sent lions among them. That's a great move. I've got to say,
Zing.
Respect for that. Just like I've tried a few other measures. Let's try lions. I think it's time for lions.
I'm telling you guys, God has a sense of humor.
He created lions as well, so he gets double credit for this move, which killed some of them. So the king of Assyria was told, "The nations that you have carried away and placed into the cities of Samaria do not know the law of the God of the land. Therefore, he has sent lions among them, and behold, they are killing them.
They violated
They
the
do not know
NEP.
the law of the land." Yeah, these lions are upholding the NAP. That's right. Then the king of Assyria commanded, "Send there one of the priests whom you carried away from there, and let him go and dwell there and teach them the law of the God of the land." What's the motivation for keeping the law of the land? In this case, is to not be killed by lions.
So
go on.
This is actually in many ways a proto-gospel, going with the theme that there are a lot of elements in this passage that are like prototyping with what would eventually become the gospel. Earlier we saw some vague idea of a Trinity that was bad and not correct. Now we're seeing some vague idea of God's faithfulness to the loyal Gentile over the historic people of the blood. The Lord in this part, the Lord is basically preferring loyal Gentiles to who are willing to convert versus disloyal Jewish people who are under the former promises that are been violated, basically. And you see here that the pagan king of a pagan nation is more loyal to God and concerned with His word than those who were sent away.
It should also be noted that the Gentiles in the New Covenant are converted by Christ, the Lion of Judah, and the Gentiles here are converted because they fear lions from Judah.
Yep, there you go. This area has a lot of echoes of what happened in the Gospels. It's quite a fascinating chapter.
I have to say, I prefer Jesus to act to literal lions, so that's also an improvement.
All right, let's carry on, shall we? So one of the priests whom they'd carried away from Samaria came and lived in Bethel and taught them how they should fear the Lord. But every nation still made God of its own and put them in the shrines of the high places that the Samaritans had made. Every nation in the cities in which they lived. The men of Babylon made Succoth-Benoth. The men of Cuth made Nergal. The men of Hamath made Ashima. And the Avites made Nibaz and Tartak. This is like reading science fiction. And Serphavites burnt their children into the fire to Adramelech and Anamelech, the gods of Sepharvaim. They also feared the Lord and appointed from among themselves all sorts of people as priests of the high place, who sacrificed for them in the shrines of the high place. So they feared the Lord, but also served their own gods, which is what you were saying, John, that they just added God in. It's like they wanted to kind of do church on a Sunday, but then live the rest of the week in keeping with the secular society around them, would maybe be a modern equivalent. So they served their own gods of the after the manner of the nations from among whom they had been carried away. To this day, they do according to the former manner. They do not fear the Lord, and they do not follow the statutes or the rules or the law of the commandment that the Lord, the children of Jacob, who He named Israel, commanded. Any comments on any of that?
Yeah, my bad. I guess they weren't so great. No, these would also be some of the first people to convert. Also, amongst these people, these are like the great grandparents of like the women by the well in Samaria, or other very early church peoples of Syria in general. The Lord is working already here to kind of bring in the gospel in the future. I think it's so imperfect right now. It's broken, but now they at least are aware of the Lord. So when Jesus comes to show this God, they'll at least know which God this one is.
And another thing to remember is, unlike the people of Israel, they're less culpable because they don't have that whole history of God saving their people and stuff. Like Israel got to witness various miracles throughout their histories and pass on that information to their children. So they have a lot more culpability than the Gentiles, who just move in there and fear the Lord among other gods. While God probably doesn't appreciate the fact that they're hedging their bets, at the very least, He's not holding them to the same standard, because He recognizes that there's a difference between someone new coming into a relationship with Him and disabusing them of their past bad religious habits, as opposed to the Israelites who he's been working with from generation to generation.
Bethel, Alaska. Were the Mormons right? That's your headcanon, Mr. Patriarch, not history. The Saturday morning Jews, weekly pagans. Yeah, exactly. Let's carry on. The Lord made a covenant with them and commanded them, "You shall not fear other gods, or bow yourselves to them, or serve them, or sacrifice to them. But you shall fear the Lord, who brought you out of the land of Egypt with great power and an outstretched arm. You shall bow yourselves to him, and you shall sacrifice. And the statutes and rules and the law of the commandment, and that he wrote for you, you shall always be careful to do. You shall not fear other gods, and you shall not forget the covenant that I have made with you. You shall not fear other gods, but you shall fear the Lord your God, and he will deliver you out of the hand of all your enemies." I think it's interesting, this term fear. Why would it be the word fear is used? I always thought that was strange when I was growing up. I was like, why fear of God? That doesn't seem right. Like, surely we're always encouraged to love God or be reverent of him. But what about fear? Like, is it good to be motivated out of fear? But it's repeated over and over again, isn't it, in the Bible?
Well, I mean, yeah, it's possible to both love and fear in the same person, but in two different senses. Like, for example, I have a fear of I had a fear of my parents growing up, but I also love them. I had a fear of their authority because I realized that they have a power to punish and reward as a form of encouragement. So I'd always feared displeasing them. But at the same time, you also have a knowledge that they're using it for the good, to improve yourself. And as long as you have that idea at the end of the day, then you basically have a healthy relationship with your parents as authority figures. If you don't, because they're bad authority figures and they abuse the fear you put into them, and they're always just coming down hard on you, well, they're probably just not worthy of that authority or position. On the other hand, there are kids who don't have any fear of their parents and they just do whatever they want. And because of this, they kind of mistake their love for a kind of permissiveness that allows anything and everything to go on, which also isn't that great either.
I just checked in. This, by the way, is our Twitch. We have 2 viewers over there, so I was wrong. We don't have 1; we have 2. I underestimated our viewer base by half.
Wait, is the window currently open? Because it might be counting you as a viewer, in which case you might just have
that's
1.
True. That's a good point. Well, maybe I need to change the category to just chatting. I've clearly made a terrible mistake there. Question: fear out of respect, fear to disobey and upset them?
Yeah, fear out of respect. Like, you really don't want to cross somebody you love and, have all those bad consequences. Like, having a healthy fear of a bad consequence is ultimately good for you.
Yeah. You shall not fear other gods, but you shall fear the Lord your God, and he will deliver you out of the hands of all your enemies. However, they would not listen, but they did according to their former manner. Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever believes has it. Hang on. I think we've run into the chapter from last week.
Oopsie.
This is the problem of my glitchy software. If there's fewer verses than the previous week, suddenly I was like, this doesn't feel like 1 Kings.
All right. Go back.
Yeah, should we just
wow, this is just some
seamlessly
great.
transition?
I was thinking, wow, they really foreshadowed some of the New Testament stuff.
I know, I should have asked you. So, John, what do you think about this bread of life, mentioned in 1 Kings?
Well, I'd really have to consider my views on transubstantiation.
Yeah, however, they would not listen, but they did according to the former manner. And that, I believe, is the end of the chapter. So, does anybody have anything that they wants to say about the whole chapter that he did not bring up as we were going through?
Yeah, I do want to just say one thing. In terms of like fear and love, something to keep in mind is this. It's possible if you're kidnapped to have a kidnapper who treats you really well just to stop you from running off. They don't really have your best interest at heart, but they'll just show a lot of love and affection and spoil you rotten. That's not out of any love or fidelity to you. But on the other hand, you could also have a fear of an authority figure, but realize that even if you don't understand the fact that they're doing something for your benefit, it still remains the fact that they are. So one can have just a misunderstood idea. And that's kind of how God in the Old Testament is coming across. He's just coming across as mean. But when he's trying to disabuse you of child sacrifice, I think you can kind of understand why he comes across as being a little mean.
Yeah, it makes sense. Oh, sorry.
Oh, Dinah. Sorry, go on.
It makes sense why God is often referred to as Father in the Bible, because it is a very similar kind of love. It's, watch your child constantly make mistakes, and you try to like steer them in the right direction, but they still refuse to do it. So they need some kind of consequences. So it makes sense.
Perhaps we can learn parenting lessons from this. If your children disobey you for long enough, then send in the lions.
So, yeah. Another thing to consider is the fact that terrible kings are usually marked by the fact of how frequently they lead their citizens into idolatry. And those that avoid it and enact the old religion are always those that are considered to be good kings in retrospect. And the authors always tie in that fact. It's never something like how good were they for the economy or how great was their foreign policy. It's always about whether or not they encouraged right religion within their society. So that's another thing to consider as well. Like King Ahaz might have had a very killer economic policy, but that doesn't really matter.
Doesn't matter in the end, yeah.
Although he was probably a filthy Keynesian. I knew Linda, I knew you'd like.
They always are.
Yes, and they always finish the every king. It says, as for the other events in such and such reign and all he did, and whether the line went up, they are written in the books of the annals of the kings of Israel, whatever it is. Great. Well, I think we've done a good job on that chapter, everybody. Let's give everyone, all our guests, a chance to plug what they've been up to. Let's start with Dinah. What's going on?
Right. Well, I'm starting a new YouTube channel very soon.
Hey.
Yeah. It's not this app yet, but I haven't started any videos yet. So you have to. You probably should follow me on Twitter to see what's going to happen. But I'm going to be talking about literature, basically. And I also write for The Mallard. We are kind of reactionary conservatism. We're really fun. I actually had another one of my articles published today, and it's very good. It's about Polish intelligentsia, so I do recommend you to have a look. And I have a blog, but yeah, follow me on Twitter.
A new YouTube channel being spawned. I think this channel has spawned more YouTube channels than viewers, which is potentially unique.
Not gonna lie, it helped.
John Fisher, how about you?
All right. Well, right now I am working on my series on Lumen Gentium. Recently, I've done a few interviews with various people. My last interview was with a blogger called Contra Sedevacantism, where we explored common critiques and made very beginner, but I think poignant objections to the position of Sedevacantism. For those of you who don't know what Sedevacantism is, that's just the idea that every pope after the Second Vatican Council is really an anti-pope and a secret heretic who really inverted the Catholic faith. So if anyone's interested in looking at a video for that, it's my most recent one up on my channel, Original Win Productions. And I've also recently had a response blog to an evangelical blogger by the name of Ken Temple on my Medium blog posting page. So you could also see that as well. And please like, share, and subscribe to Lambda's channel. And if you like his content, I'm pretty sure you're going to like some of the stuff on my channel as well. So subscribe to that channel too.
Yes, do definitely. I 100% endorse John Fisher and everything he produces. You consider it your moral duty to go and subscribe to Original Win Productions. The Templar.
I still haven't written anything on the Substack yet. I've been kind of lazy. I've been trying, but that's still the same. I think it's still in the video description if it's the same from last time. Yeah, not much happening here. I'm just kind of busy.
Larue says, when are you going to do debates? That's a good question. I asked, was it last week, for suggestions for debate topics, and only Settler commented the name for a debate. So, Larue, go and give me a comment on what debate you want to see, and I'll be much more likely to set it up.
Could I make a suggestion for the channel, because I have a debate in mind?
Ooh.
Okay, and I actually know myself and another willing participant. It's on hell. All right,
perfect.
So it's a debate on whether or not annihilationism is biblical. My friend believes it is.
Yes.
I believe it is not.
I'd love to be on that debate too, because I got a lot of thoughts on that.
Yeah, okay, I am definitely for eternal conscious torment, gang. So I do take the classic view on that one.
I forgot to mention, actually, Lambda AA mentions you in almost every video now, so maybe he'd be something.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he considers you a community leader. So
wow, I'd not heard this.
You should maybe debate with him on some topics. He'd probably be happy to. I also mentioned I think I might be doing something with the British Knight tomorrow about a topic of like what happened with American culture in the 1970s and why did it lose its willpower to do anything. It's like we land on the moon and just kind of decide to eat burgers and do nothing after that. And then I think it's tomorrow's also the Foundations podcast, so another architecture stream on early colonial empire sort of stuff, like 1600s, 1700s into the Edwardian or something. Basically turn of the shift from the Spanish Empire to the British Empire as the world hegemony, that era. Excuse me. So that'll be tomorrow, probably. I mean, I'm on Eastern Standard Time, but it'll be tomorrow around 3 or 4 p.m. I don't know what that translates to in UK time, but that's it.
Fantastic. We've had a couple of suggestions in already from Larue. I can't argue with his his speed of response. Is the kingdom of God to be Israel restored? So yes.
If Israel is the church.
So that strikes me as we pick what is it, Romans 11 as the chapter 1 week, and we could talk about that.
Yeah.
I actually take the view that it is going to be restored, because I do believe at the end of time a remnant of Israel will return to the church.
Yeah, so, they'll be Christian though, right?
No. Yes, it will be. I think, the church is obviously Christian, but what I'm saying is I think I'm a post-millennial, oddly enough, so I would actually take the view that all the Jews at the end will be restored to the faith.
Hopefully, yeah.
I thought post-millennials were called Gen Z.
Different post-millennialism.
Yeah.
And there's another one. Was Jesus born with sinful flesh?
Oh, that's from last week.
Old news, Larue. We've covered this already.
No, he was not. He was born with perfect flesh.
He only had the appearance of
Rome, the harlot in Revelation. Oh yes, we must do some Revelation. I had it down in my plans to do a bunch of Revelation stuff.
I actually agree that Rome is the harlot. Actually, no, I would take the opinion that, I think Rome is the beast, but I would say that the harlot is Israel itself.
Yeah, this is a correct. Israel likes to ride whatever tiger is the most powerful one at the time.
Are we alienated from God at birth? We better not answer them all now, or we just won't have the debates.
Yeah.
Here's a topic: exploration / colonialization. Colonialization is basically nihilism cope and rebranded as Gnosticism.
I
That's a
wouldn't.
collection of jargon, isn't it?
I don't know. I
Come on.
wouldn't. I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that because, like, what was the desire to go out and colonize and explore the world? Right. It was a desire. I mean, fundamentally, it was a desire to learn if there was something mystical out there, like a Fountain of Youth or Gold City, like all of these stories that you hear about why they went into America and what they were looking for. It was never. It actually was very rarely to preach the gospel. It was mostly for treasures, and then they found people and were forced to do the religious stuff. I think the only exception to this might be Cortez, who is actually a decent Christian man, other than his polygamy. And
yeah.
And ironically, the first churches in the New World were built by Vikings a good 500 years prior to the Spanish arrival. The first churches in the sagas do record that the Vikings built churches and the natives were beginning to convert. So that's an interesting thought about like where the Vikings seem to be not after nihilism and rebranded Gnosticism. The Vikings seem to actually be interested in spreading the gospel, and all they really wanted was good wood. Like literally, the reason why they went to the New World was like, hey, we want wood for ships. We're like, and like they built like maybe 1 or 2 colonies. But it's an interesting thought about like the difference in the worldview. I like as an American, I'm more of the view that we should take the Leif Erikson pill and exemplify him as what we are rather than Christopher Columbus, because Leif Erikson came to the New World to preach the gospel, to get some decent resources, and to like respect the local people, whereas Columbus took the opposite approach. He's here for golden glory.
I would like to point out something. It's very telling that you would approve the Scandinavian as the Lutheran here over the Italian. Although,
to be fair, they're
we've got an offer to defend the Jesus has sinful flesh position.
I don't know. He did that. He tried to do that last week, and he was pretty bad at it. I don't want to lose one of our.
Just saying that because you disagreed.
I don't want to lose one of our very few viewers.
LaRue, you have an opponent right here, ready to take the challenge.
Yeah.
I was going to mention as well, this week on Tuesday, I'm doing an interview with Northern Man, who sadly cannot join us at weekends at the moment because of his work schedule. But yes, so do tune in for that. Did we go through everyone? Yes. Lithemplar, you said that you're doing your Substack.
Architecture stream tomorrow. The Foundations podcast. You have to type in the when you search it because YouTube doesn't.
You have to put in the because if you don't put it won't find the stream.
You'll find you'll find some Montana marriage counseling service. I don't know why. Anyway, that's all I gotta say.
Daniel Marsden's just shown up. All right, we'd better go back to the start again and redo the whole Bible study if he's just shown up. And Johnny saying that's great finding ways. Great. That's probably everything. So thanks for tuning in, everybody. And yes, catch us in a week. I'm thinking at some point we might settle down and do a book all the way through, chapter by chapter, rather than jumping around all over the place. So if you have a book that you think would be fantastic for us to cover start to finish, let me know.
How about the letter to Philemon?
Yeah, that'll really set us for that'll stop me having to think of chapters week by week for a real long time, won't it?
I was actually thinking because April Fool's is coming up and April Fool's is on a Thursday, maybe you could have a stream of some like apocrypha literature that would like get people's workings over. Either something like the Didache is really good to go through, or my personal favorite, Enoch, where you get to see like a couple of pre-Christian like Trinitarian thoughts in late term Judaism.
We're not going to do Decline of the West.
The letter to the Romans is actually a pretty decent one because it actually forms a lot of New Testament theology on justification. And it also goes deeply well into the difference between the Old and New Covenants.
Suggestion for Psalms. Maybe because we could do like a cycle. So we could be going through like Psalms and Romans, for example. We just alternate between them. Maybe that's the way to do it. Because if we just stick in one book, we'll end up with quite samey streams potentially for a long time. So I don't know. Let me know what you think, or if you'd prefer for the scattergun approach, where I've been just picking different things every week, and it's like a surprise. If you prefer that, let me know.
Oh, do you know what would really be good and would do a good job of being fresh every week? The Book of Revelation, or Revelations. It's a very good one because each chapter has its own intricate details of imagery, poetry. Like you could comment on quite a bit of it, and even though the genre still stays the same, each chapter is just so fresh in its own idea that it's very hard for it to get tiring.
Yeah, we've had shout outs for Third John. So yeah, I guess and Romans, I suppose between Third John, and Revelation, maybe the author ought to at least be called John, is what I've kind of picked up from the requests.
John is a pretty good writer.
I think it's an overrated name. All right.
Ouch.
Thanks for tuning in, everybody. I'm just kidding. I love the name John. See you next week. Well, see you on Tuesday.